Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Carol Armstrong, a professor of art history at Yale. Professor Armstrong teaches and writes about 19th century French painting, the history of photography, the history and practice of art criticism, feminist theory, and the representation of women and gender in art and visual culture. She has published books and essays on Degas, Manet, Cézanne, and 19th and 20th century photography, and has curated several museum exhibitions. She is an art critic and has been a frequent contributor to October and Artforum magazines. She is also a practicing photographer. Today we'll talk with Professor Armstrong about her book project, Cézanne's Gravity. Welcome, Professor Armstrong.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So, let's begin with your book. Please give us an overview of it.
Okay, just to be very brief, it's about the afterlives of the painter Paul Cézanne, who is generally held to be the father of modernist, that is to say 20th century abstraction. It's a book that pairs Cézanne, or in some cases puts Cézanne together with two or more other figures, with a variety of different kinds of writers and thinkers from the 20th century, beginning with the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who wrote letters to his sculptor wife about Cézanne when he saw his work in the 1907 Autumn Salon, which was one of the sort of array of different exhibitions, annual and biannual exhibitions that were replacing the old state-sponsored salons. Then it proceeds with a chapter that's dedicated to Cézanne and his relationship with the Bloomsbury figure Roger Fry, who was also involved with Virginia Woolf and her painter sister Vanessa Bell. Fry was responsible for the term post-impressionism with an exhibition in London in 1910 that featured Cézanne among others as the kind of father of a new era of art. But he wrote a book about Cézanne in 1927, which was the year in which Virginia Woolf also published her breakthrough novel To the Lighthouse, which is about a woman painter. The third chapter from which I get the title for the book is about Cézanne and Einstein as the sort of, on the one hand, the father of a paradigm shift in art and the father of a paradigm shift in science. Though Einstein never actually wrote about Cézanne in any way. The fourth chapter is about Cézanne and the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who wrote extensively about Cézanne beginning in 1945. And then the final chapter is concerned with Cézanne and various figures in the psychoanalytic and neuroscience discipline from the early 20th century on to the present time.
Okay. And what led you to write the book?
A number of things. I had done an exhibition on Cézanne and written a book that went with it at the Getty back in 2004. I wasn't sure that I wanted to write a monograph on Cézanne, but I did want to come back in a kind of selective way to Cézanne's very groundbreaking work. I wanted to extricate Cézanne from how he's been normalized as a sort of father of abstraction, and go back and look at and recover the strangeness of Cézanne's work. And then I also wanted to use Cézanne to reconsider and perhaps rethink the timelines of 20th century art into which he's been put.
Okay, so when you say the strangeness of his work, what do you mean?
Well, in thinking about Cézanne as the sort of father of abstraction, people have tended, I think, to see his work as going in the direction and leading sort of inevitably to abstraction. And so they've focused on a kind of 20th century understanding of Cézanne as really interested in the sort of flatness of the picture plane and really thinking in advance of abstraction. And that's led to understanding him as a kind of pre-cubist, pre-abstract figure. And I think that's not adequate to an understanding of Cézanne. I think we really need to go back and sort of understand the peculiarity of his work, the strangeness of the spaces that he creates, the strangeness of the sort of points of view, the way in which objects are peculiarly warped, the very peculiar relationship between objects and space that we find in his work, among other things.
Okay, so you mentioned Virginia Woolf, Einstein, and then in the realm of the cognitive processing. How do those all relate?
Okay, well, since these are all about the sort of afterlives of Cézanne, sort of 3 out of 5 of the chapters are concerned with people who actually wrote, figures who actually wrote and or were thinking about Cézanne. 2 of the chapters are concerned with the chapter on Einstein and the chapter on psychoanalysis and neurocognitive processing. Are concerned with figures who didn't actually write about Cézanne, so there's a more indirect connection. But in all cases, we are looking at the afterlife, but the afterlife of this painter, sort of phenomenally influential painter, as sort of thought about from a fresh point of view, to emphasize the peculiarity of the work. Sort of Virginia Woolf is interested and was interested, as was Roger Fry, the art critic and curator, in sort of rethinking the timelines of modernity and the experience of time in modernity. And I want to argue about Cézanne that he too makes us think about the time of the painting or of art history differently as well. As for the neurocognitive processing, it has more recently been argued by a number of figures who work in so-called neuro-art history or neuroaesthetics, that we can look at Cézanne and famous aspects of his work like the unfinish of his paintings. The fact that they leave parts of the canvas bare, that you can see some parts of the canvas will look more complete and other parts will have sort of brushwork that is very loosely related to a motif that you can recognize. So it's been argued that we can look at his work in relation to cognitive processes of how the brain makes sense of the world. I'd like to take a look back at those ideas from the vantage point of the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who suggested very hypothetically in 1945 that Cézanne may have been schizoid. Which was a term and an idea that was beginning to circulate in the fields of psychology and psychoanalysis.
And based on what, do you think?
Based on the oddity of his work and also certain oddities of his biography. Merleau-Ponty was a philosopher of something called phenomenology. And part of the 1945 essay, which was called Cézanne's Doubt, was to kind of revisit and sort of rethink our ideas about the relationship between an artist's life and their work. So it's a hypothesis which he's very clear cannot be a diagnosis, but which depends upon a kind of strange relationship between the things that Cézanne is representing and the kind of unfolding way in which they are represented.
Has Cézanne ever written, or has anyone written for him, his thoughts, what he was thinking when he was painting? Yeah,
there was a lot of writing. Cézanne's own letters were collected, and towards the end of his life, he became a kind of apocryphal figure. He went from being someone who, next to Van Gogh, was the least successful in terms of selling work or receiving critical or in terms of critical success in the Parisian art market. He, for the most of his life, kept in his hometown of Aix-en-Provence. But he was known for sort of saying sort of rather Sphinx-like utterances. But when he began to be exhibited in Paris in the last decades of the 19th century, and younger artists, emerging artists, began to write up his apocrypha, began to visit him, and began to transform him into what we now know him as, which is the sort of father, or the primitive, as they put it, of modern art. There was a sort of collected series of sayings that are attributed to Cézanne, which we can either find in his letters or in these apocryphal collections.
Right. Let's talk about Einstein a little bit. Tell us how Einstein's work is related to Cézanne's work.
Okay, Einstein is usually related to modern art through a kind of popularization of the mathematics, the non-Euclidean mathematics that Einstein relied upon for his theories of relativity, which were first published in 1905, a year before Cézanne's death, and then later in 1915. Usually the connection between these sort of popularized versions of non-Euclidean geometry and the so-called fourth dimension, which was the popular version of what would become known as relativity. The connection to art is made through Cubism. First in 1911, the poet Apollinaire, and then the next year in 1912, when two Cubist followers of Picasso and Braque, the painters Glaise and Metzinger, wrote up a book called Cubism, in which they related Cubism to the fourth dimension and to the geometry that was created by Riemann. So usually when we think of relativity and a kind of watered-down version of Einstein's ideas and modern art, we think of Cubism. I want Picasso, to push it back.
Right, okay. And why do you want to do that? Partly because of the way in which Cézanne, like Einstein, stands as a kind of revolutionary figure who revolutionized his field, just as Einstein revolutionized his field. But also because of, I think that some of the less well understood aspects of Einsteinian relativity correspond better to the look of Cézanne's pictures. So, for example, the non-Euclidean geometry that Einstein was looking at was really a geometry of curved space, which it applies much better to the kind of undulations, the focus on round objects, on a space that sort of keeps flowing and moving, which corresponds a little bit better to the curved space of relativity. Because also Cézanne's spaces are ones in which time and space come together.
so that instead of the picture corresponding to a single instant in time, which had been the sort of classical idea of what a pictorial space was, you have a picture which corresponds to an eye which keeps moving in time, shifting from one point of view to another point of view to another point of view, always in motion, which is, I think, much closer to the sense of what happens in relativity, which is you have multiple viewers who, and the space-time continuum that Einstein speaks of is really in relation to a series of viewers who have different vantage points and are moving at different rates relative to each other, hence relativity.
Right.
And I think that corresponds better to what happens in what I would call the space-time of Cézanne's paintings.
If you had to pick one of Cézanne's paintings as your favorite, what would it be and why?
Oh dear. Well, I would pick one of his still lifes, and this is a book that really does correspond to his, focuses on that genre. And I suppose I don't have one single favorite painting, but there's a kind of culminating, very famous still life called The Apples and Oranges, which is a very luscious painting, which does everything that I've just described sort of in spades. There are multiple vantage points. There are a kind of proliferating world of objects sort of rolling about in a space which won't stay put, which keeps moving and which keeps curving and shifting around those different objects. So that would be one of my my picks for a favorite Cézanne.
Okay, and when will Cézanne's Gravity be available?
Well, probably not for another couple of years. I'm sort of nearing the end of the first draft of the book, and then it will have to be go through edits and so on.
Well, we will look forward to seeing that then. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you again.
For more information about Professor Armstrong, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.